Speaking of changes, even something as familiar to us at this point as the profile might need to change. In this case, on this sculpture it did need to change, and therefore some changes were made to the profile. If possible, I suggest trying to make these changes something that expands the profile forwards, or in this case, since it's laying down, upwards, versus pushing the profile down or into the face. It's much easier to expand and build the profile up or out than it is to push it back down by removing clay. Removing clay from the profile now to redraw it would mean creating a bunch of flat spots in places where we really want the form to turn naturally. Building the profile up a bit taller simply means those form turns have a chance at becoming broader and softer, which frankly is more forgiving when it comes to modeling anyway. All within reason, however. If things get too far out of whack here, we don't get soft form turns, but sort of this pyramid-shaped triangle, which is of course not what we're after. Once an improvement to the profile has been done, this time through adding some clay along the profile, that change has to be allowed to radiate outwards and in this scenario downwards into the rest of the nose. Make sure that any changes to the profile actually happens along the profile, which in the portrait, and thus the nose as well, usually means down the center, which should be carefully marked with a center line. Once the clay is added, we need to add clay perpendicular to the profile and connect with our other widths. This is essentially addition of volume, and volume is clay that exists between one border and another border. One border being the profile and the other border here being the width that we've established for the tip of the nose, or sometimes it can be a form that we've drawn on the surface of our sculpture as well. I will usually build another wall of clay sort of in the same way that I build a profile, leading down from the profile perpendicular to it and connecting to whatever the border it should connect with, be it an overall width or the ending of a form. If we let too many of these cross-sectioning walls, if you will, sit there on our sculpture, or these walls become too tall, the work can become a bit confusing to look at, too abstract. So I try to integrate them into the rest of the sculpture by moving out from the wall and adding clay around it once I confirm that the volume that I've added was okay and functions as I wish. You will see this repeat itself in many other places on the sculpture throughout the entire process, and it will certainly repeat itself in the same places as well many times. Terminology is perhaps a bit of a boring topic for some, but it's important that we speak the same language here so that we can understand each other. And of course, I'm not talking about English, I'm talking about the language that we use to explain sculpture. The profile is the contour as it appears from the side view, of course. We've covered that extensively. A width that functions as a border might be something like this edge of the nose tip, or a form edge like this one might also function like a border for us. The clay between these two we refer to as volume. Volume essentially describing how a form turns from one border to another. We want to have as much volume as we can get away with, since it has a tendency to make our sculptures appear softer and more fleshy. Less volume or too little volume often makes a sculpture appear really flat, and often it's going to lead to very sharp edges as well, sharp transitions. Almost every one of us has a tendency to be struggling with adding enough volume, which is why I talk about it so much and tell everybody to add more rather than less. Because without saying this, 90% of you would add way too little volume, because volume is frankly very tough to perceive. It almost has to be felt more so than it has to be seen, or it can be seen rather. This brings me somewhat seamlessly, hopefully, into my next topic, which is observing from below every now and then. By foreshortening an object like the nose, we can all of a sudden study how forms turn. In other words, how much volume we actually need. Because this is a tricky consideration to be making, it's not really something we ask our students to attempt to study deeply until they're in their third year, when they sculpt a reclining three-quarter figure. Observing from below finally lets us see if we've dealt with depths symmetrically as well. We can't perceive depth accurately from the front, and so we have to turn depth into left and right, or sometimes up and down. And we do this by observing from the side views and dealing with depths from the front, from the side. However, of course, you can't see both side views at the same time, and so you can't easily observe if your depths are symmetrical necessarily. But observing from below something allows you to see both side views at the same time and therefore judge your depth symmetry. In most cases, we're going to be looking for more symmetry rather than less. Most of us will struggle with symmetry much more than a natural sense of asymmetry, let's say, so it's better to focus on the latter rather than the former. Especially when it comes to the bony structure of the skull, we need to set up a lot of symmetry. If we're dealing with things that are not bone, things like the cartilage in the nose, for example, we can afford some more asymmetry. Know what you're sculpting. Know what your sculpting is meant to represent and treat it accordingly. If it's bone, then look for symmetry in all orientations, and if it's flesh, or sometimes even cartilage, we can be a little bit more lackadaisical with treating symmetry. Make sure you don't get tunnel vision. Try to switch up the view you're working from around every 25 minutes. I would suggest working for 25 minutes, then take a 5-minute break. Perhaps you go for a short walk, or perhaps you simply look at your work. Then switch where you're observing it from and start working for another 25 minutes. This way the work develops in the round and no one side is too far ahead of another side. I would strongly suggest maintaining this rhythm no matter what kind of subject you're working on, be it portrait or figure, and of course, find yourself a set of views and then stick to those. Don't try to use 360 degrees. In this scenario, for example, we're essentially observing on equal terms from 3 views, 2 side views and the front, and then we're taking peeks from below as well. Even after you've started dealing with the front view, it's going to be a good idea to get back to the side views every 25 minutes. This way, no big issues develop or get built into your work by the virtue of you not being able to see it. It's both a safety mechanism in that sense and also a smarter way of working. Especially if you're working alone, it can be tough to stay disciplined with this, but you will find the process a lot less annoying, frankly, by doing so. It might be tough because you're having to deal with the second side that doesn't look as good more often, but it will benefit your work and the overall process of your work. Back to the front again, following along with previous advice of changing views every 25 minutes. From the sides, we adjusted heights and depths, and from here, from the front, we can now begin to adjust our widths again. The changes are going to be smaller, but we're slowly zeroing in on what will hopefully be a pretty accurate result. To make some of these smaller adjustments, I like to use a rake tool to lightly trim the widths into place. Another technique for dealing with widths that needs to be reduced would be to cut using a knife or a knife-like wooden tool. But I prefer to not cut because cutting always feels a bit rougher compared to lightly sanding the work into place using a rake. It felt like that improved the work more than cutting. Unless the change is big, of course.